China just admitted something devastating. For the first time, Beijing ordered local governments to scrap major investment projects. Not delay them, scrap them. Why? The money doesn't exist anymore. It traces back to one monster, the property debt complex that powered 30 years of growth and now suffocates the entire system. This isn't about falling home prices. This is about how one broken sector infected everything, trapped households in debt, starved governments of cash, and left Beijing scrambling with fixes that don't work. The system is collapsing in slow motion. Nobody knows when the final collapse happens, but everyone knows it's coming.
In China, the property sector is facing another potential crisis. A major state-owned developer is under pressure. It is called China Vanke.
For 2 decades, China's property sector was the engine that made everything run. Real estate and construction represented over 25 to 30% of GDP. One sector, 1/4 to 1/3 of the entire economy. It wasn't just about building homes. Property sales generated revenues that flowed to local governments, tax income that funded schools and hospitals, jobs that employed tens of millions, and confidence that made households feel wealthy enough to spend. Here's how it worked. A family wanted a home. They'd put down a massive deposit, sometimes 30 or 40% up front, to buy a property that wasn't even built yet. Developers took that pre-sale cash and bought more land. Local governments sold that land at inflated prices to generate revenue and pay back debt. Banks financed it all, adding leverage with each cycle. Everyone got rich on paper. The illusion of infinite growth became real enough to believe in. But this entire mechanism depended on one thing: prices always going up. Always. The moment that assumption broke, the structure collapsed. That moment came in 2020 when Beijing introduced the 3 red lines policy to cap developer debt. Instead of cooling the market, it triggered a liquidity crisis. In late 2021, China Evergrande Group spiraled into default with over $300 billion in debt. The crisis spread like contagion. Country Garden defaulted. Kaiser collapsed. By 2025, over 40% of major developers were flagged as high risk. Prices across China's 70 biggest cities didn't ease. They caved. And if that sounds severe, it's nothing compared to what comes next. If you've ever wondered how a single bad decision can destroy an entire economy, what you're about to learn will shock you. But before we go deeper, please do hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on what's coming next. You see, for the average Chinese family, buying a home wasn't an investment decision. It was the investment decision. It was how you stored wealth, secured your child's future, proved you'd made it. Generations liquidated their savings, borrowed from parents, and mortgaged their futures to own property. At its peak, household mortgage debt reached over $6 trillion, representing 1/3 of the country's entire GDP. Here's where it gets painful. Chinese households didn't just buy one property, they bought multiple properties as investments, believing prices would never stop climbing. Pre-purchase deposits consumed 30 to 40% of a family's net worth. For young families in major cities, mortgage payments are 40 to 50% of their entire disposable income. That's money not spent on food, education, or entertainment. It all went to a property that stopped gaining value. Then the market stalled. Prices fell. Families watched their life savings evaporate. The wealth effect reversed. Instead of spending, they panicked and cut back on everything. Between 2023 and 2025, households stopped borrowing altogether and started paying down debt aggressively. For the first time in modern history, mortgage loans outstanding actually declined. The damage to consumer confidence was immense. China's Consumer Confidence Index dropped from nearly 200 in 2021 to around 86 by 2025, a catastrophic collapse. Millions of families shifted into survival mode. Household savings surged to 152 trillion yuan by 2024, up from 82 trillion in 2019. Youth unemployment hit 21.3%. Younger generations gave up on the dream entirely. They stopped having babies, they stopped spending, and they stopped believing in the future. What they didn't know was that this quiet withdrawal was about to choke China's grassroots governments, revealing a financial wound far deeper than anyone imagined. Here's something most people don't understand. China's local governments don't operate like Western municipalities. They have almost no property taxes, no income taxes, no traditional revenue sources. For 3 decades, they relied on one cash cow: selling land use rights to developers. Land sales revenue accounted for over 38% of local government income by 2019. More than 1/3 of every city's budget came from developers paying for the right to build. This system worked beautifully during the boom. Local governments would buy rural land cheap, transform it with infrastructure, and sell it to developers at huge markups, sometimes 300 to 400% gains. With that money, they built highways, schools, hospitals. They funded pensions and public services. This model powered China's infrastructure explosion, but it created a horrifying dependency. When the property market stopped, those revenues vanished overnight. In 2024, land sales revenue dropped 16% year on year, accelerating from a 22.4% decline in 2023. By mid-2025, revenues had fallen another 6.5%. But even as revenues collapsed, local governments couldn't cut spending. So what did they do? They turned to local government financing vehicles, or LGFVs. These shadow banks used government-owned land as collateral to borrow from banks and generate cash. It was technically off-balance sheet debt, invisible, unaccountable, and explosive. By 2024, total LGFV debt had exploded to 58 trillion yuan. That's approximately $8 trillion in off-the-books debt with no clear way to repay it. By March 2024, the situation was so dire that Beijing publicly axed massive infrastructure projects just to stop the bleeding. But that tourniquet came with a hidden consequence, and the next victim is the very banking system holding the entire economy together. Chinese banks are connected to the property crisis at every level. They finance developers' land purchases. They took developer bonds as collateral for their loans. Others issued mortgages to households. They lent to LGFVs using land as collateral. Even link in the financial chain is contaminated by property sector bad loans. When developers default, when LGFVs can't repay, when households stop paying mortgages, banks take the losses. By 2025, over 40% of major developers were classified as high risk with default probabilities exceeding 20%. Banks are holding enormous amounts of debt that's almost certain to be written off. The government has forced banks to keep playing along, extending loans to zombie firms and purchasing government bonds at artificially low rates. Banks are essentially financing the government's attempt to stabilize a broken system. Their balance sheets are deteriorating. Their profitability is declining. Their capital buffers are shrinking. This is unsustainable. Beijing authorized a whitelist of eligible property projects that banks must support financially. But most struggling developers don't qualify. The golden age of easy bank credit is over. A developer that would have gotten a loan automatically in 2015 now can't borrow a yuan. Credit has frozen. Construction has halted on countless projects. Millions of Chinese families have paid for homes that will never exist. Their money is trapped. Their banks are trapped. The system is trapped. The People's Bank of China cut interest rates to record lows, but lower rates didn't stimulate lending. Banks refused to lend to risky developers. Households refused to borrow for homes they'd lost faith in. Cheap money couldn't revive a market that no longer trusts itself. And if that sounds bad, the real story starts when you follow that collapse into the mountain of debt China can no longer outrun. Here's the nightmare scenario that keeps Beijing officials awake at night. China's debt to GDP ratio is approaching dangerous territory. The property sector's debt to GDP ratio alone exceeds 250% when you include household mortgages, developer liabilities, and LGFV obligations. Add in non-property corporate debt, and China's total debt load is now over 280% of GDP. For context, most developed economies operate in the 150 to 200% range. China is operating in uncharted territory. This debt didn't just appear randomly. It was systematically created by a model that functioned like a Ponzi scheme. Each cycle required more debt than the last. Developers need cheap credit to build properties. Governments need land sales revenue to service debt and finance projects. Households needed cheap mortgages to buy those properties. The system only worked if growth never stopped, prices never fell, and everyone kept borrowing. But growth has stopped, prices have fallen, and households have stopped borrowing. Now, Beijing faces an impossible choice. If they raise interest rates, they accelerate corporate and government defaults. If they keep rates low, consumption stays suppressed. If they pump new money into the system through stimulus, they're just adding more debt to the pile. If they cut spending to reduce debt, they trigger a recession. Every policy option leads to pain. Every path forward involves losses. The central government has already started drawing down its sovereign wealth reserves to plug holes. Foreign reserves are quietly eroding. Policy space is shrinking fast, and the clock is ticking. But the next shock doesn't hit the government. It hits the people whose savings are now entombed in concrete skeletons across the country. Drive through Chinese cities in 2025 and you'll see a haunting landscape of half-built apartment towers, cranes frozen mid-construction, and concrete skeletons casting shadows over neighborhoods. Estimates suggest there are millions of unfinished residential units across the country. Families paid for homes that don't exist. Their money sits trapped in developer bank accounts or has already been consumed to service other debts. The human cost of this financial disaster extends far beyond balance sheets and the GDP numbers. This creates a social catastrophe that goes beyond economics. A family that paid 3 million yuan, that is $400,000 for an apartment in Shenzhen in 2015, now lives in a home worth 2 million yuan. They're underwater on their mortgage, locked into a property they can't sell without taking enormous losses. A college-educated young professional earning 200,000 yuan per year sees the numbers and realizes they can't afford to get married, have children, or build a life outside the city. They're trapped by inherited debt, unfinished homes, and a collapsing job market. The psychological damage to a generation is already evident in plummeting marriage rates and birth rates that are accelerating downward each quarter. Thousands of home buyers organized mortgage boycotts starting in 2022, refusing to pay mortgages on properties that were never completed. It was an act of desperation, and it worked in getting government attention. But the fundamental problem remained. The money was gone. Developers had spent it. Government had spent it. Millions of families are now trapped in a debt disaster they never created and can't claw their way out of it. It's easy to imagine that kind of despair stops at the doorstep. Wait until you see what it's doing to China's ability to spend, grow, and breathe. China was supposed to be transitioning from an investment-driven economy to a consumption-driven economy. That was the plan. After decades of infrastructure booms, households would become the new engine of growth. They'd earn higher incomes, feel wealthier, and spend more. This would reduce China's dependency on investments and exports. The economy would become more balanced, more stable, and more sustainable. Beijing made this transition a central pillar of its long-term strategy. None of that happened. Instead, consumption as a percentage of GDP inched upward at a glacial pace, from 51% in 2020 to 55% by early 2025. It was supposed to reach 65%. The gap represents hundreds of billions in missing consumption. Households aren't behaving like consumers anymore. They are behaving like survivors. Confidence collapsed, youth unemployment soared, housing costs devoured disposable income, savings surged as people prepared for uncertainty instead of embracing for a brighter future. By 2024, per capita household spending reached just $4,802 in China, compared to $8,258 in Japan and $15,353 in South Korea. That gap is enormous. Chinese households are saving too much and spending too little. The government launched consumption vouchers and trade-in programs, but these were temporary patches. People don't feel confident enough to spend beyond necessities. Retail sales barely exceeded inflation. Restaurants, entertainment, fashion, sectors that should boom when an economy is healthy remained stagnant. The only growth came from necessities like groceries and utilities. Anyone who thinks a nation living on necessity spending is already in crisis is missing the real story. Because the real fracture, the one that could break everything, begins the moment trust evaporates and China's confidence is thinning fast. In China's case, the vulnerability is the yuan. If another shock hits, a trade war escalation, geopolitical tensions, or further developer defaults, Chinese residents might suddenly decide their savings are safer in other currencies. There's already informal demand for dollar conversions. If formal capital outflows accelerate, the People's Bank of China would burn through foreign exchange reserves to defend the currency, depleting reserves much faster than planned. Once confidence in the currency is shaken, ordinary people make rational decisions to protect their savings. They convert yuan to dollars, euros, or crypto. Banks tighten lending to preserve capital. A credit freeze cascades through the economy. Small businesses can't get financing to pay suppliers. Supply chains break down. Layoffs accelerate. Savings get liquidated in panic selling. The system enters a death spiral that's nearly impossible to reverse. Economists call this a confidence crisis, and once it begins, it's almost impossible to control. Argentina experienced this in 2001, Turkey in 2018, Russia in 1998 with devastating consequences. In each case, warning signs were visible for years. Nobody wanted to believe it could happen. Then it did, and it was catastrophic. China's warning lights are flashing now. The debt is unsustainable. The growth is slowing. Confidence is eroding. These are the exact conditions that precede a confidence crisis. If you found this breakdown helpful, hit the like button and share your thoughts on where China's economy is headed. And remember to subscribe for more clear explanations of the global forces shaping the world.